conversation stage. Again, I'm Anjana Ahuja, and I'm a freelance science writer and a columnist for the FT. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this next discussion. I have a vested interest in effective science and technology journalism. So I want to introduce to the stage Mhairi Aitken. Thank you. Timandra Harkness. And Melissa Heikkilä, who moderated our last panel so brilliantly. Can you sit there? And I'm going to sit here so I don't get in your way. No, if you sit there, that'd be great. Thank you. So in turn, I'm just going to get you to introduce yourselves, say why you're here, and on the panel, where you're from. Yeah. Mhairi.
Yes, I'm Mhairi Aitken. I'm an ethics fellow in the public policy programme at the Alan Turing Institute. I have particular interest around public engagement with AI and data science, and I do a fair amount of media engagement around AI, especially in the last few months since the little thing on ChatGPT came out. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be part of this panel and to have some reflections on media engagement around AI.
Excellent. Timandra.
Well, I'm Timandra Harkness. I do some radio, so I presented 6 series, I think, of Future Proofing and various other documentaries. I wrote a book called Big Data, Does Size Matter?, which I was told I was allowed to wave. It's yellow, like all other books, apparently.
That's very good.
And I'm a member of the Royal Statistical Society and one of the people that founded their data ethics and governance section, because my life is pure glamour.
Melissa.
And hi, I'm Melissa Heikkilä. I'm a senior reporter for AI at MIT Technology Review, where I write about AI. And my background is actually in the social sciences, political science. And before joining MIT Tech Review, I covered AI policy at Politico Europe. So I know all about European legislation and AI.
Excellent. So we haven't really pre-planned this session because I wanted it to be very organic and you know, I'm sure things come out, and especially after the talk from Gary earlier that Melissa curated so magnificently. There are so many themes in trying to get the science and tech right, as it were. And I thought what I would do is I would ask each of the panelists a question for them to sort of get a deep dive straight into where they're coming from. So my one question to Mhairi is, what has been your best experience of interacting with journalists, and what has been your worst?
Yeah. I think I'm quite lucky. I don't have any horror stories, so so my worst is not going to be terrible. I haven't. Maybe I'm lucky, or I haven't had any terrible experiences. Probably the most difficult experience, and it's sort of a learning curve for engagements with media. Probably the most difficult is I've had a few times when you go into, say, maybe a live radio show, and generally you'll have a brief call with the producers beforehand to give a kind of brief overview of what we're going to talk about, and often it's very general, talk about ChatGPT. Then you come live on air, and the first question is, this person has made this claim, is this right or wrong? Or there's this use case, what do you think about this very particular example that you've never heard of before? And that can be a bit rabbits in the headlights when you're on air. But I think what's really important to remember in those situations is, to know what you want to say, to know and to just say what you want to say, and not to be kind of taken off track. The best. I mean, I think over the last few months since ChatGPT came out, we've had a fairly unprecedented, sustained level of media interest in AI. And the best thing about that has been that we've really been able to engage with all kinds of media and all kinds of audiences. So it's not just science-focused outlets. It's not just broadsheet newspapers, but I've done interviews with like Cosmopolitan magazine, and it's really cool that these discussions are getting to kind of all audiences, all members of the public, and all kinds of outlets. And I think with that, there's a real opportunity to raise awareness around AI and to generate kind of wider public interest and public engagement with AI.
Okay, Timandra, my question for you is, what does journalism get wrong about AI and why?
Well, I could put that briefly and say there's too much, either the white plastic robot pointing at your screen, the robo-splaining, or the Terminator with red eyes. But I mean, more seriously, I think there's a lack of curiosity in And I think, this is a problem across journalism.
From whom?
It's not from journalism. Not necessarily just individual journalists, but also editorially. It's very responsive. So, you compare the amount of coverage that the ChatGPT models have had and DALL-E and things that people can play with. And a lot of it has been about, oh, look, I did this cool thing, but is it really cool? Will it take over all the students writing essays? And relatively little curiosity about things that we are being told, that we're being given. So people that produce AI say, oh, look, here's this cool thing. Why don't you have a play with it, see what it can do? Well, I would like a bit more. What else are you doing that you're not telling us about? What are the other things? What went into getting you to this point? How else might it be used that you're not telling us about?
So there's a sense of missing the bigger picture.
Exactly, missing the bigger picture. For example, perhaps I'll come on to that later on, but I think a tendency to take things at face value and not to proactively go out and say, well, what else is happening actually? I caught a little bit of Gary's talk in the previous session where he's saying there are lots of things we do every day that use AI as very basic tools, and we don't tend to think about that as AI. I would love to get more under the bonnet. Here's the next thing that's actually going to underlie, how aeroplanes fly or how transport is planned. And those are the things that could really make a difference tangibly to our lives. But we tend to get a bit caught up with the shiny toys and the anthropomorphic, I think.
Okay. Melissa, for you, I wanted to ask you, how do you balance as a journalist, as a tech AI journalist, how do you balance the competing interests of, on the one hand, getting industry insiders to trust you and give you stories and share what they're doing, some of that under the bonnet stuff which maybe isn't easy to talk about, but how do you, but also writing stories that they don't necessarily want published?
It's a really tricky balance to strike. On one hand, you really have to cultivate those sources, build trust, and be worthy of that trust. Whenever I go into conversations with people, I make it really clear, on what terms we're talking. Is it off the record, background, on the record? I never want anyone to be surprised or, hurt or anything like that. And sometimes it's not writing stories. I've known a lot of things, but they've been told to me in confidence, and not every scoop is worth getting, every sort of incremental scoop. So I made the calculation that, okay, this person is in the right place, right time, knows stuff that might be, might be useful, and this small scoop is just not worth it, breaking that trust. So I've not written about stuff. And then if I do write about stuff, I always try to be super fair and super transparent. So nothing should come as a surprise. I often send, a long email to their press person saying, these are the claims, do you have a response? Being super detailed so that when the story does come out, they've had time to at least emotionally prepare for it in some way. So yeah, being trustworthy and having that sort of transparency and being very upfront about my intentions and that. But also, they know I'm a journalist. They know it's my job. So there's only a certain amount of hand-holding I can do.
Yeah, and also there's the sense that journalism is about telling people things that someone somewhere doesn't really want you to know. Can I, just before we take questions from the audience, which is going to come a bit later after our conversation, but I wanted to ask the audience whether, and this could be very painful for us as media people, but can you put your hand up if you think AI is covered well in the media?
I won't be offended.
Whoa. I didn't. I thought we were going to get a diss. I didn't realise it was going to be that bad. Who thinks it's covered badly?
Well, you should read MIT Technology Review.
Who is actually equivocal about it? It's neither good nor bad, or I don't even read it. Who reads it and thinks of it kind of, it's neither here nor there? Okay. Who just doesn't bother reading it? Oh, okay. So we do have interest in this. What do you think the role, and I'm going to open this to the panel, what do you think the role of journalism is in holding those who create and push AI, if I can put it like that, to account?
I think it's incredibly important, and like that's what kind of gets me up in the morning. I think Silicon Valley is not very transparent, and these tech companies, these massive, massive tech companies, have so much power over technology that's being rolled out in everyday products that affect us. You know, they're being rolled out in the cars we drive, but also in systems that determine whether, you know, we get public benefits or housing or in our education system. And if those systems are not transparent and we don't know what's going on, they could be extremely devastating. And that's why it's so important to have journalists who understand the tech, understand where the issues are, like you said, and can hold them accountable. Because, you know, when in the past we saw technology companies like Facebook rise, and then we were all so enamored by that technology that, you know, we all know what happened with Cambridge Analytica. And I think this rise of AI tech is similar in a way, and we have to be super alert to kind of avoid those mistakes we did 10 years ago.
I'm going to ask you to put your questions on Slido. Do share them. I can't seem to connect at the moment, but we might be able to sort that out. Oh no, we can get some of them. What do you think? Well, actually, let me hear from the rest of you in terms of what do you think the role is of.
Well, I mean, I broadly agree. I think it's remarkable how reverent we are to people producing this kind of technology as opposed to other kinds of technologies. I mean, you think about the amount of scrutiny that, I don't know, people who build cars, aeroplanes, energy companies, all the other systems that we rely on, the water companies in this country. I mean, obviously, the holding them to account doesn't seem to work very well, as in getting them to change anything. But the level of detailed scrutiny about what they actually do and the impacts, compared to companies in Silicon Valley and outside. And I'm not sure why that is. I think it's some combination of the fact that perhaps people who do understand how this stuff works just find it so much more exciting and lucrative to work inside those companies than to try and be a journalist outside. But that's not really an excuse, because I think most people who report on, say, energy or water companies are not engineers, but they see how important this stuff is, and they go and find people who do understand and talk to them and educate themselves and do some digging, like journalism, basically, as it should be. But I think the other part of the problem is that we have had this tendency to say, oh no, but those companies are good, and they're good people, and they're going to make all our lives better and shinier. And therefore it seems almost rude to hold them to account and be critical of them. That it's like, oh no, but you know, they're on our side. They're good, these companies. They're not like the evil companies that make weapons or dig for coal or something. And so I think there has been a great failure. But perhaps it's a failure of journalism that's wider, that there is less investigative journalism now, there's less properly critical news journalism. I don't know.
But I think on that point of holding people to account, like there is a problem in reporting around AI, that a lot of it is focusing on AI, what AI is capable of, what the future of AI might be, or the dangers of AI, and not necessarily looking at the decisions that are being made by the people, the organizations, the companies around how AI is being designed, developed, and deployed. And it's really, really important that in reporting that we focus on those decisions, on, it's not what AI is capable of, but the decisions that are being made about in what context we're deploying these systems, how these systems are being designed and developed, and what the decision-making around that has been. And I think there is a real danger with that kind of rhetoric and that narrative around the capabilities of AI, or what AI might do, that we're kind of distracting from looking at the organizations and where the accountability is. And that's a really, really important message.
So do you think in some ways that, so we had that first session on ChatGPT, do you think that we should have had more focus, or could there be more focus on what lay behind that? Because we're talking about the outputs, aren't we, essentially, of ChatGPT and, oh, you know, isn't it amazing if you put this in, isn't it terrible it comes out with that? But we don't step back. Is that what you're saying, that we should have more?
Yeah, and I think particularly in the case of ChatGPT, we've seen that really clearly. Where there has been coverage of concerns, it's often been, you know, the concerns that, you know, students might use this to cheat on essays, or, you know, how it might be misused in the future, rather than, well, what has been the process through which this has been developed, and has it been, you know, have ethical considerations been addressed in designing and developing this system, rather than, I mean, I think that a lot of the attention on, you know, will students use it to cheat was sort of, you know, there's a tendency to demonize students rather than focus on, well, how these systems are already being used. And for example, in education, there's AI which is being used to monitor and survey students, but we're not talking about that. And certainly in the case of ChatGPT, we could give a lot more coverage of the design processes, the development processes, and the decisions that are being made there, and to move away from that kind of, there's a narrative of inevitability. None of this is inevitable. These are all choices, these are all decisions. And those decisions are what we should be focusing on and reporting.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go on, Melissa.
One approach, which I hope was more common, but something I've been trying to adopt is instead of doing the kind of classical tech reporting, which you've seen, you know, which here's a new gadget, here's how it works, instead of that. And then that's kind of morphed into the business reporting. Here's the business of tech. I've tried to approach it more like political reporting. You know, like, here are the power relations, here's a dynamic, this is why it matters. And I think if we did that, if we applied that lens to tech, I think the conversation and the stories would be way more impactful, and I think maybe easier to understand even.
Yeah.
I think that I am going to throw in a question here, because it's relevant to what we're talking about. And there was a question on here. I'm trying to find who it was from. Oh, here we go. It's an anonymous question. But who should cover AI? Science and tech journalists, business journalists? AI cuts across home affairs, health and policy. Should it be everyone's business? So who should cover it?
Yes, it should be everyone's business. Sorry to jump in. But I think that's exactly what I was actually thinking of saying, that in many ways, we get caught up with AI as if it has agency, as if it's a thing in itself, as if, you know, we've already reached the singularity and the AI is going out there deciding what to do and intervening in human life. But, you know, as Mhairi was starting to say, actually, most of the time we should be concerned, I mean, as well as with the kind of the back end, but with people deciding to use it. And often, I think it is used as a way of avoiding the people being held to account. So, I mean, you know, the decision-making algorithms, and instead of a human being saying, well, you know, I'm going to exercise my judgment, and this is how we're going to decide which families need welfare, or what marks students get when they couldn't take their exams. We have an algorithm for that, and then I can outsource all my responsibility to the algorithm. And in those cases, yes, you should look at the algorithm, but you should also look at the people who decided that this was a suitable case for an algorithm to make a decision, and say, well, how did you come to that choice yourself that you were going to use AI to do this? What about you do you think that an AI would be better than you to ask this question? So, and those things do cut across all sorts of areas of life. But again, I think maybe there's a reticence about journalists in other fields because they feel, oh, I don't understand how it works technically, so I can't really investigate that because I won't understand how the programming works. Whereas actually, in many cases, maybe you don't need to understand how the programming works. Maybe you need to talk to the people who decided to implement this and get them to answer your question.
One of the things I worry about, because I write about AI as part of, you know, I write about absolutely everything really, but AI is one of the things. And yes, it is generally dominated by science tech journalists like me, people who report on Silicon Valley for the FT, you know, on all sort of startups. But we do it in a, you know, it is a very sort of siloed kind of journalism in a way, unless it's the sensational, you know, ChatGPT told me how to swallow crushed glass or whatever. But my worry is, as a journalist covering this, is that your view of what my journalism or a good outcome might be would actually end up being PR for you?
Well, I mean, I think not, well, I think not for me. So I'm an ethics fellow, so my work focuses on kind of ethical considerations around AI and how AI is designed, developed, and deployed. So, I mean, good PR for me would be good coverage because it would be you know, raising awareness of ethical considerations around AI. Well, that's brilliant. We should have much more discussion and much more coverage of the ethical dimensions of AI. So yeah, I mean, maybe in some cases there might be an element of PR if this is an AI industry focused piece or AI being developed by industry. But there should always be a critical lens that's, you know, asking those questions. I think that point about you know, needing to focus on the people and the organizations and the decisions is so important, because that's what enables, you know, that's what engages people with AI. And I think if we're always focusing on the technology, we kind of limit the debate and we limit the engagement to people who are interested in technology, people who are, you know, drawn to discussions around technology. Whereas actually, if we're talking about the politics, the economics, the business decisions, the ways that this is affecting everyday lives, it's relevant to everybody. You know, it's relevant to everybody. It affects, you know, access to healthcare. It affects provision of educational services. It affects housing. It affects finance. It affects how you shop. You know, it affects all aspects of our life. So how could it not be relevant to everybody? And I think that's the message that we need to get across. And that you don't need to be kind of tech focused or, you know, somebody who's into science and technology to be engaged and interested and asking critical questions about AI. And so that's what I think is really important about good journalism around AI, to bring people into this conversation. And, you know, from my perspective, working in ethics, bring people into those conversations around what should and shouldn't we be doing with AI, in what context is it okay to be developing these systems, and what are the kind of the limitations, the limits to acceptability around how AI is being used.
Should it also be political? There's a question here about this from Mike. Do you think journalists understand that artificial intelligence is as much a political project as a technological one? And it's interesting because, didn't we? We saw that ministerial address earlier about, you know, that UK wants to go really fast, really quickly on AI, wants to become a leader in this industry. Now, for me, that's interesting from one point of view, but it also rings slight alarm bells on another when we're talking about regulation, exactly the kind of questions that have already come up. It was how do we do it safely? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. And again, sort of focusing on the choices that are made, political choices, policy choices, choices around regulation and governance, and moving away from that inevitability, that these are all choices. I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's really important that journalists are engaging with it and highlighting that, to what extent that they do. I mean, I think to varying degrees, maybe in different, different journalists to different extents, perhaps.
But political, I mean, Melissa, but do you ever, when you write your pieces, do you ever talk to politicians?
If it's a policy story, yeah, often. But if it's a regular, here's an AI development, then no. But that's mainly because politicians often don't know what they're talking about. I think there's hope. The Financial Times just appointed their first artificial intelligence editor, who is a very, very good journalist. Bloomberg just hired an amazing new AI journalist. I think AI journalists, people who are specifically focused on the tech, were a pretty small crew, but that is growing. And I think now as these technologies are becoming more prominent, they're getting more political attention, the European Union is working on the world's first AI law. Once that comes into place, I think we'll have an even greater political understanding of this technology, and hopefully newsrooms will also pay more attention to this. But I'm already seeing lots of really positive developments from newsrooms, yeah.
A really interesting question, which is, again, has touched on something that's come up, which is the anthropomorphization here. And we often talk about, someone said here, we talk about hallucinating, you know, the hallucinations that are produced by things. Is this a problem when we cover it? Because obviously, as people, we want to connect. And I want readers to connect with my stories through what I write. And so, is that a trap that I'm falling into? I mean, do you worry about that?
Yeah, All the time.
Humanizing your copy?
Absolutely. It's something we think about a lot. And it's so easy to do because our language hasn't really adopted to the new technology and what it's capable of. And one of the things that really, really annoyed me about the New York Times story about Bing and Sydney and how Sydney told him to leave his wife was how much anthropomorphizing they did. They were like, the AI told me it had feelings and blah, 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 it loved me. And I'm like, no, the AI can't do that. It doesn't have feelings, it's not human. But, you know, people with the kind of platform that the New York Times is are still falling into that trap. That is incredibly frustrating. Whenever, I'm sure I've done it too, but I try to really pay attention to it and try to think, you know, instead of AI, this is just a computer program. You know, just like swapping out that word, and then suddenly it becomes really hard to anthropomorphize it. You know, a computer program can't tell you it loves you, right? Like, yeah. So it is.
Although it's tried.
Yeah, it's definitely something we need to be careful about because the way we use language also gives these technologies, give these tech companies a lot of power. You know, if we keep talking about OpenAI, who's developed an AI system that can, you know, do all these amazing things that humans can do, it actually can't, but it's great PR for these tech companies, and I'm sure it'll help them boost their image. So, yeah, it's super, super important.
What about, Timandra, the humanizing aspect? I mean, is this a trap that we're all falling into?
Well, I think so, and it's, you know, it's obvious why, because as humans, we relate best to other humans, and this is why AI companies give their products a human form, because if we feel we're interacting with a human-like intelligence, then we are more likely to engage with it and interact with it. And as journalists, if we have a human-like character, then again, it's more relatable. But I mean, I think this is a case actually where it's good to step back and look at the wider cultural context, because AI is one of those products that, because it has no form in itself, it really reflects back to us whatever we want. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting, the idea that you produce a super intelligent AI and then it solves all the world's problems. Like, you know, we can solve world hunger and disease. All we need to do is invent the super intelligent AI. Like, well, maybe we could just address the hunger and disease directly, but no, we have a God-shaped hole in our lives, and so we want to create something that fills that hole. If we want more human contact in our lives, we create a human-shaped AI that reflects back to ourselves our own preoccupations, and that's again something where if you then get fixated on the AI, you're missing why is that the AI that we have? Why this? Why now? Why here? And I think so that's another case where I think, as good journalists, you should at least really step back and say, why is it this? Why have they given it that name? Why do they think that this is the best format for what's essentially an information service in many cases, or not?
We've got a question, it's really interesting, about content, and if content is mass produced by large language models, should the role of journalists change? I mean, I'm slightly worried, I have to say, about the use of LLMs and what it's doing to the information ecosystem, because there are already outlets that are using these models to produce text, which are then out there, their outputs are there in perpetuity to be scraped by other models, and you have this kind of circular thing. So what does it mean in terms of, I suppose this is a more professional thing, I mean, does technology journalism have a future?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You have to say that.
I read a weekly newsletter called The Algorithm, and I wrote an edition a couple of weeks ago about, could ChatGPT do my job? And spoiler alert, it couldn't. And this is not just my completely biased view. It's like based on what I know about the technology. So we used AI in our daily lives in journalism all the time. Google Search is AI, Google Translate is AI. I use a transcription service to transcribe my interviews. And all this is kind of boring AI that we forget is AI, but it is AI, and I use it all the time. And so enters ChatGPT. And there was a lot of talk about, will this replace copywriters? Will this replace journalists? And a couple of newsrooms did try to use the technology. So tech news site CNET, Gary mentioned it in the previous session if you were here, used one of these AI models, probably ChatGPT, to generate news articles. And the thing with these AI models is they sound great. They produce text that looks like a human could have written it. They sound authoritative, but they're confident bullshitters. They don't actually know what they're talking about. So to absolutely nobody's surprise, except maybe CNET's, all their stories were full of errors. They had to issue tons of corrections. They weren't very transparent about using this AI model as well, so they were trying to replace journalists. And that ended really badly, and it was very, very embarrassing. But then on the other hand, you have BuzzFeed, who announced that they're going to use ChatGPT to develop some sort of quizzes, which is a great use of AI in newsrooms. Because that's exactly it. It's like fun. You don't have to be 100% accurate, and it can save journalists a lot of time doing, you can ditch all the boring, mundane tasks and automate that for an AI, and then focus on things that require actual human skill, like talking to people, coming up with colors, writing more interesting stories. I can totally see it being used to format newswire stories into a more palatable format. But the kind of journalism I do, where you actually have to be critical and examine things and connect the dots, I think there will always I don't think computers are ever going to replace humans.
We have a really good question here from Valentine da Costa. Should there be more coverage of digital literacy than there is for AI? So that's come up before, this idea that maybe we don't really know what we're, the world that we're going to be navigating, and we need to, particularly children.
Yeah, and I think that's a really big part of it, that journalism has a role in increasing understanding and awareness of what AI is and what AI isn't. And certainly, in part, that's countering the kind of sensational narratives of superintelligence and conscious machines, and being very realistic about what this actually is, and explaining what AI systems are, what they're capable of, and what they're potentially capable of in the future. I think that's definitely a really important role. And for children and young people, that's a really important audience to be engaging with. In our team in the ethics team at the Public Policy Forum with the Alan Turing Institute, we're doing work engaging children with AI, and particularly around ethics of AI. And it's really exciting to be having these conversations with children and young people, and bringing them not just in from the perspective of like STEM education, not just about preparing the next generation to go into careers in AI, but preparing children to ask critical questions about AI, to understand how these systems are used, to understand how these systems affect their lives, and to understand that all of us have a say in that, and all of us should be included in those discussions. So I think when we talk about digital literacy, it's not just about developing technical skills or technical understandings, but developing the understandings that equip people to critically engage with these technologies, that equip people to ask the difficult questions, to hold organizations to account, and to understand the social, political, economic dimensions of technologies as well as the technical dimensions. And
did you want to come in on that? Because one of the things we talked about being over-sensationalized, so there could be scare pieces. But do you think it can work the other way, where actually there can be really good, valuable tech that the public are unreasonably scared by, and we're actually killing off some things by the tone of what we write and what we say, just because perhaps politicians will run shy of approving it, or people just won't want to engage with it?
Yes, I do think that's a danger, actually. And again, it's not limited to technology, because I think in society generally we have a bit of a tendency to look for the worst case scenario and then go, well, if there's a risk of that happening, we just better not even go there at all. I think this is very, very widespread in society. It's a very long-term trend. I mean, it was interesting. I was slightly waving earlier the new report, the Relevance report about regulation of digital technologies, which is kind of government policy, pre-policy piece. And I was really glad to see that warns about there's an opportunity cost. There are risks to new technologies, but there's also an opportunity cost if you never pursue them. And so, yes, maybe you avoid certain risks of implementation, but you might also avoid new developments that could let you overcome other obstacles and difficulties and risks and compensate for risks. So I do think it's a problem that everything is either this is this amazing clever thing and it's going to save us, or this is a disaster and it's the end of the world. I mean, I think the student thing was a very good example of that. And often people look at it, I mean, just as you look at the technology and say, this is going to save us, people look at technology and go, well, this is the end of the world. Students are just going to use this to write their essays. And like, well, if I thought that I was teaching students and they could get a plausible essay out of an AI and I would mark it, I might worry about the whole educational relationship that was there, that I would not have such a relationship with a student that I could tell whether they'd actually written something. And I'm sure if there are people here from higher education, they'll say, dream on, mate, I have 200 students in my class. I don't even know their names. Half of them are online. But, you know, I rest my case. I think the problem there is not the AI.
I think on that point, so we need to address the sensational coverage, and this is generally journalism relating to science and technology, that it tends to focus on the sensational breakthroughs, either something really controversial or something remarkable, like the big breakthroughs. And most of the research is actually just incremental advances. And that isn't covered. And I think that it would really help in terms of understanding illiteracy, to understand the process of research better, that this is not all spectacular breakthroughs. Often it's little steps, incremental advances. And also with AI, I think as researchers, we need to more proactively engage with the public and proactively engage with the media to raise awareness of what AI is. So it's not just it's not just Silicon Valley, it's not just ChatGPT, but if there was coverage of things like charities and community organizations using AI as systems to process community data, to maybe understand things about their local environments or about their communities, to advocate for their needs. Those kinds of things, like that's a different kind of discussion, and I think that would have more understandings of the possibilities of what AI can do. It's not all these big models, big programs, it's not all the controversial things, but actually what AI could do for members of the public, for communities, for charities, for civil society. And that will lead to a different kind of discussion, and also I think different kinds of engagement with AI, bringing people into those conversations. So yeah, I mean, I don't know within the current kind of journalistic approach, like how we move away from all there's space for sensationalism, but move away from the sensational arguments into more realistic discussions of what AI is and the full range of things that AI can do.
I can see the tension there, because if I've got to pitch something to my editor, it's not going to be the incremental sort of, step up from what we've seen before, and it'll be, and well, we know about that. It will be the radical stuff, because that's the stuff that catches our attention. Can I ask how many of you sort of engage with the media now as researchers? Thank you. Are any of you that haven't so far, would you be more encouraged to do so after not necessarily attending this session, but by thinking about these issues generally? Or are you still scared of, oh no, maybe it's not quite the right thing? But
my DMs are open.
Definitely. So how do we get better coverage?
We'll look at each other.
To ask that big question, how do we get better coverage? And I know we'd all have different sort of definitions of what better is, but the one thing that you would recommend people.
I think from a research perspective, it's to be more proactive and to proactively engage with the media, not just react, because I think that is the problem, that often we're invited to do interviews, or we're asked to respond when there's a controversy or when there's something that's kind of already, the headlines are already there, and actually we need to be engaging proactively to tell the more realistic stories of what's really happening with AI, to tell about the research that we're already doing.
But how do you do that practically? I mean, if someone wants to do that kind of media stuff, how would they do it? How should they do it?
Yeah, I mean,
make contact with journalists, DMs.
There's, relationship building with journalists is definitely a great way to do it. And, we work with institutions like the Alan Turing Institute. We have a very good comms department who has existing relationships with the media. And there are ways of, and so capitalizing on those resources and that infrastructure that's already there, but also being proactive. I mean, you can write blogs, you can write comment pieces, you can, there are lots of things that you can do to get your voice out there and to make those connections with journalists. And yeah, sometimes it's responding to particular requests, and sometimes it's proactively saying, look, this is a really great story. And many times you might not be, it might not go anywhere. Many times you might not get a response. Something you think is a great story might not be received with the same enthusiasm from editors. But if when you've got a story to tell, it's, there are ways to try and do that, to get that response. Write comment pieces, write blog pieces, get your voice out there. And yeah, I think we should be more proactive in doing that.
I think it would be really helpful if pitches were, you in your pitch you made it really clear that, okay, this is why it matters. I get I probably have 100 emails right now in this session about like, oh, this AI tech launched a new VC round or whatever. I don't care. But if there's a story that a pitch is like, clearly this is something my audience would like, and it's here's why it matters to people, societies, or the field. Just like improving that relevance, that would help a lot. And I think from the newsroom side, tech journalists tend to be a very homogenous bunch, lots of white dudes. And I think if newsrooms really paid attention to that, like we all bring our own biases, our own life experience to our stories. So having a more diverse bunch of reporters, having more women, having more people of color, having people from like all ages, focusing on these things, I think then we'll find the interesting stories. We'll find the unique angles that everyone is not covering.
I should add that one of the questions we had on Slido, this was anonymous, is where are the male AI journalists? So we've done quite well at sort of bucking the trend here. But there
making the tea.
There is a problem. I assure you, we're probably not represented.
Could I just jump in quickly to that question though? What could we do better? I think one thing journalists could do better is be more curious and less intimidated. I think there's a less intimidated. I think for non-specialist tech journalists, well, non-specialist journalists. I mean, having said earlier, everyone should be covering this. I think a lot of people are very intimidated by thinking, I don't understand how this works. I don't, I'm a typical humanities grad who scraped some statistics later. I can't write code. I can't do this stuff. But what I can do is go and find the people and ask them the questions and ask them the idiot questions, because most of my readers are in the same boat as me. They also probably can't write code. But that shouldn't be a barrier. It shouldn't be like, oh, well, I know, but I don't understand how this works, therefore I can't ask the questions. You need to ask the questions. You need to get out there on behalf of everybody else who also doesn't understand this stuff. And if they don't explain it, then ask more questions. And I think, again, it's this slight undue reverence to something just because it's about computers and maths. Whereas, if you were talking to someone about a new building, with some amazing new energy system, you wouldn't just go, oh, it's got an amazing new energy system. You go, how does it work? Where does the heat come from? Why is this better than what you had before? That willingness to go out and actually push and ask questions, I think we could do with a lot more of that.
And hopefully have people answer them.
Well, that would be ideal.
Well, people love talking about their work, so that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, excellent. So what kind of, actually I'm going to make this the last question really, is what kind of expertise do you think journalists need to cover this? I mean, you've said about generalists, you don't have to be a tech specialist, and I can sort of see that tech journalism has the same issue as with science journalists. So I do have a science background, and most tech and science journalists do. But actually I worked with a fantastic science journalist at the Times who didn't. He was actually a historian. And it enabled him to ask questions that perhaps I didn't ask because I took it for granted. It's about asking the silly question. So what expertise, just very briefly, do you think people need to be a tech journo?
I mean, I think we need very broad expertise and backgrounds, broad perspectives. So not any particular, I wouldn't point to any particular expertise. because coming from all different perspectives and backgrounds is going to lead to better rounded coverage. And so if you're specialised in health and you focus on how AI is being deployed in health contexts, that's a particular set of expertise and focus. The same in legal contexts, in education contexts, and like all these different forms of expertise and knowledge are important to ask the right questions and to explore not just how AI is being developed, but how it's being deployed and how it's being used. So I think that there isn't any particular kind of expertise. We need all forms of expertise to ask the right questions and to get that coverage that we need to really understand what AI is in our lives.
I totally agree with that. And like a lot of you don't need to know how to code or how the black box works. Like nobody knows how the black box works, but but you don't know how to do the things to write about it and understand it. And I think a lot of it, I come from a non-technical background. I'm a social scientist, and a lot of it is just understanding the basics, like how how data is scraped, how it's trained, like the power dynamics and how this thing works, and that'll take you really, really far. And yeah, like you said, asking silly questions from the computer scientists, if they can't explain it to you, then it's probably bullshit. Like, so just having that kind of audacity to do the stories, to ask the silly questions, and often people who are really like experts in these things, they think about really complicated concepts all the time. So asking a really simple question can really throw them and give you a really, really interesting answer that they haven't thought about that actually brings the story forward a lot. So that's why we need journalists from all different education backgrounds.
Yeah, but you also need to talk to us too. So please talk to us, even if you've not done in the past. Do. I think we're going to call it a day there. We're going to wrap up. But thank you very much for all your questions online and in the room. We're going to take a break for lunch. Lunch is going to be served on the 3rd floor, that's here just outside, and on the 5th floor. You can go to either location to grab food, but if it's busy down here, head upstairs. Please don't go yet though. If you need assistance, just head to someone in an orange t-shirt who will help you. And last but not least, can we thank our guests, Mhairi, Timandra and Melissa, for a really insightful session on journalism. So let's